There's a specific kind of person who watches a trend hit 20 million views and feels absolutely nothing. Not disdain, not judgment, not even curiosity really, just a quiet, unmoving no. The world looks at that person and calls them a contrarian, stubborn, secretly insecure, someone who thinks they're above it all. But here's what nobody talks about. Psychology underneath that stillness isn't arrogance, it isn't fear, and it has nothing to do with social anxiety. It's something researchers have actually documented. And once you understand it, that person makes complete, perfect sense. Picture the moment. Everyone at work is doing the same audio clip. Your feed is a wall of the same dance, the same filter, the same caption format, slightly modified, repeated endlessly. A friend texts you, "You should do this one." And something inside you very quietly closes. Not slams, closes. You don't announce anything. You don't explain yourself. You just don't do it. And then you watch everyone else do it, and you feel strangely fine. That's not social performance. That's not coolness. That's a psychological orientation so fundamental to how you're built that participating in the trend would feel like wearing someone else's clothes. There's a word for what you're experiencing. Several, actually, but let's start with where it comes from. Because people who don't join trends didn't arrive here by accident. This didn't come from nowhere. For some, it started early. They were the kid who got excited about something, really genuinely excited, and then watched that exact thing become popular and felt something strange happen. The interest didn't intensify when the crowd arrived. It dimmed. Not because they were trying to be different, because the arrival of the crowd changed the texture of the thing itself. Psychologists call this reactance. Robert Brem's research on psychological reactance, first developed in the 1960s and still considered foundational, describes what happens when a person's sense of behavioral freedom feels threatened or pressured. When a behavior starts to feel mandatory, even implicitly, something in the brain registers it as a constraint. And the automatic response to constraint isn't compliance. It's withdrawal. The research shows this is not a personality flaw. It is a hardwired self-protection mechanism. The brain reads social pressure, even low-grade, cheerful, everyone's doing it pressure as a potential intrusion on autonomy. And some nervous systems are significantly more sensitive to that signal than others. What's fascinating is that the people most activated by reactance tend to score high on openness. They are not closed to new things. They are actually intensely curious. They just can't access that curiosity when the door is being held open for them by a crowd. The trend kills the interest. Not always, but often. But here's what's fascinating, and this is where the psychology gets strange. It's not just reactance. There's a second thing happening underneath it. People who never join trends often have what researchers describe as a high need for uniqueness, but not in the way that phrase usually sounds. This is the one that usually makes people go quiet for a second. The need for uniqueness isn't vanity. It isn't ego. In the psychological literature, particularly in work by Lynn and Snyder, in the early 2000s, it refers to something more precise, a deep, motivational drive to maintain a differentiated sense of self, to feel like your choices actually belong to you, that your tastes are the product of your own interior. It's not a negotiation with what's currently circulating. People with a high need for uniqueness aren't trying to be interesting. They're trying to stay coherent. Their identity feels most intact when they can trace a clear line between what they value and what they actually do. When a trend sweeps through and everyone they know adopts it simultaneously, that person doesn't experience it as fun. They experience it as a kind of identity noise, a blur. They might genuinely enjoy something, a song, a format, a joke, right up until it becomes a trend, and then the enjoyment quietly exits. Not because they decided to stop liking it, but because the thing changed. It used to be theirs, in whatever small private way. Now it belongs to everyone, which means it no longer functions the same way. That's not snobbery. That's how meaning works for certain minds. If this is landing, somewhere you don't usually let things land, like you're finally hearing a description of something you've always just quietly done, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribing means the next one finds you too. And we haven't even gotten to the part that most people who skip trends never consciously realize about themselves. It's the piece underneath all of this that actually explains the most. That's coming. Because so far we've talked about what pushes these people away from trends. But here's what most people miss about this. There's something being protected that's much more interesting than independence. People who don't join trends are often people with a very particular relationship to attention. Not fear of it. Not contempt for it. Something more specific. They have an internal standard for what earns their public self. a kind of unspoken criterion for what actually represents them enough to share. And most trends, by definition, ephemeral, collective, nonspecific, don't clear the bar. They'll post something they made, something they thought through, something that is, in some traceable way, actually theirs. But they won't post the dance. They won't do the audio. They won't write the same caption that 12,000 other people wrote in the same week, not because they think, because they feel a kind of integrity cost when they do it. A small interior debt. Most people don't have that cost. Or they have it and decide it's worth paying for connection, for visibility, for the pleasure of participating. That's completely legitimate. But for people who never join trends, the arithmetic just doesn't work, and it never has. Now, and this is the part that takes a second to sit with, there's a cost buried inside this orientation, a real one. High psychological reactance and a strong need for uniqueness can, over time, narrow a person's world without them realizing it. They can mistake their aversion to collective behavior for discernment, when sometimes it's just avoidance dressed in the clothes of taste. The research on this is genuinely evolving. But what we do know is, there's a line between having your own interior standard and using that standard as a wall. Between staying authentic and slowly becoming someone who has reflexively decided the crowd is always wrong, which is still, in the end, letting the crowd make the decision for you. That's the paradox. And it's harder to hold than it sounds. The person who never joins the trend is protecting their autonomy. But autonomy defended against everything eventually looks a lot like isolation. Not dramatic isolation. Quiet isolation. The kind where you're always a half step outside whatever everyone else is doing. And that used to feel like clarity. And now, sometimes just feels like distance. And here's the part that sounds counterintuitive, but is completely true. The people most committed to never being influenced by trends are often among the most self-aware people in any room. They watch the mechanics of social contagion with a clarity that most people never develop. They know which emotion a trend is selling. They can see the structure underneath the content. They're not missing what's happening. They're watching it very closely. They've just opted out of performing their presence in the expected way. Everything up to this point is the why. What comes next is something rarer, the part where it starts to make a different kind of sense. Not just psychological sense. Something closer to meaning. Because here's what the world calls people who never join. Trends. Late, disconnected, difficult, out of touch. And here's what that description misses entirely. These people are among the most reliable sources of actual cultural memory. They're the ones who remember what something was before it got flattened into a format. Who can tell you what a thing meant before it became a soundbite, a template, a challenge? Who kept their relationship to it intact long after everyone else had moved on to the next thing? Trends exist in weeks, sometimes days. The people who never join them live in longer time. They still know what they actually think. About music they discovered before an algorithm served it to everyone. About a film they watched alone and loved quietly for years before it became a reference. About a way of dressing, writing, cooking, laughing that they arrived at slowly. Through actual preference, not through the momentum of what was moving through a feed that week. That's not nothing. In a culture built on half-second retention spans and the constant replacement of one viral moment with another, it's actually rare and increasingly, quietly valuable. And if any of this feels bigger than a video can hold, like it connects to something deeper about how you move through the world, or how much it costs to stay that way, that's a real signal worth listening to. Talking to someone who actually knows this territory is never the wrong move. The central tension in this psychology is actually ancient. Every generation produces people who can't, in good conscience, simply adopt the posture that everyone around them has adopted.